Hey, how's it going? Today we're going to be looking at Zelda games out of bounds, and wow, these earlier games, they have some very interesting things going on with them. You learn a lot by going out of bounds, and you're about to see why that is. But before we get to some of the other amazing Zelda games, let's start with Zelda 1. So being able to go anywhere out of bounds has taught me a couple of things in this first game. One is that, yes, no matter which direction you come from, even if there's a giant stone wall, you're going to be able to go to that spot that it would be on the map. There's no sort of weird trickery going on where you have to be in a certain position in order to get to a certain portion on the map. The game genuinely does have its entirety of its map laid out accurately enough that you could do a screen-for-screen map of this overworld and it would be accurate. So then the question then becomes, what happens when you go outside of the boundaries of the map itself? What happens then? Well, really interestingly, there seems to be a failsafe that's programmed into the game. And what happens is whatever screen you try to walk off the map, the game transports you back to the very first screen that you start in the game in front of the first cave that you go into to get the wooden sword. Okay, well now that we got that figured out, what about dungeons? There's lots and lots of rooms in dungeons that are adjacent to places on the map that don't exist. So when we take Link through the walls there, what's going to happen? Well, as it turns out, the game also has a failsafe for this as well. And the result is that it just loads the same room you were in. But for as tight as the ship has been running this whole time, I did find one crack in the armor. And that is in level 3, right when you jump into the dungeon. If you were to go north, the failsafe doesn't seem to work here. And instead, you get these rooms that seem to read from the game's RAM, probably, because what's generated is nothing that you'll see in anywhere in this dungeon, or any dungeon for that matter. And the colors get all wacky. It's awesome. This is the kind of stuff that I was looking for. And not only that, but sometimes it'll transport you to a completely different dungeon entirely. This one, I was able to recognize. This is Dungeon 1. And the most fascinating thing about this is that the enemies from Dungeon 1 are not the same enemies from Dungeon 3. And so you can see split in half blob sprites that is being used instead of the Stalfos sprite. Or like here, just before the boss, the Dark Nut enemy ends up replacing the Wallmaster sprite, where you can see it come out of the wall and upside down, which is utterly fantastic. I love that. And here's Aquamentus using Gleeok's sprite. And before we move on to the next game, I also want to show you that it may have been possible that the sword that is placed over the Triforce in the title screen may not have existed at one point and was added in post, because the Triforce that's in the background actually has a full sprite, something that is obviously obstructed by vines and the sword blade. And also, it's just a cool little bonus here. Normally, if Link was to walk over on this wall, he ends up being on the top layer, and it looks fairly normal. However, for whatever reason on the sides, Link ends up being on the bottom layer, which allows you to now see what the bricks would look like if they were layered on top of them, which is really cool. I think one of the most frustrating things in any video game or movie or whatever is when they imply or hint at something that's hidden off screen. At the very end of The Legend of Zelda Adventure of Link, Zelda thanks Link for saving her, and then as the curtain drops, it looks like she leans in for a kiss. Well, let's see exactly what's going on in this scene. So in order to do that, we need to remove the layer that has the curtain. And when we do, we can actually see that Zelda is just giving Link a friend zone hug. No, but what's really going on here is that the Zelda sprite is just moved forward, and she's in the background layer, therefore it looks like she's just embracing Link. But there's still artifacts to suggest that this was not the intention. For example, this unique sprite of Link holding Zelda's hand remains unchanged even after the curtain drop. So what you're really looking at here is just Link with his hand out, and the Zelda sprite partially behind him. And you know what, since I've got your attention already and this isn't going to be a full boundary break episode, I might as well show you all the other interesting stuff that I found in Zelda 2 as well. For example, every single room that is in the Legend of Zelda Adventure of Link is supposed to lead somewhere. Now if that side of the room is completely blocked off with wall, the end of the screen is still going to warp Link to some other coordinate. And most of the time if it's in a temple, it just happens to warp Link outside of it. This is likely to be a preventative measure in case the player ever for some reason was able to glitch through the walls. Another thing that I noticed is that when you encounter an enemy on the River Devil, you actually get access to an unused area that was exclusive to the Famicom disc version of the game. This happens to be the King's Tomb, which was replaced by a daylight version with an old lady. Also on the northeastern part of this continent, there's a bridge that leads from this area to the maze with the temple. But the bridge itself isn't actually connected. Instead, your character lands on a tile that warps you to a different map entirely. And if you were to try to walk the entire bridge without that warp, the bridge ends prematurely. In fact, on the eastern side of this bridge, if you walked all the way left, you'd end up seeing Death Mountain, which is pretty shocking to me. Also, exploring the overworld map can be pretty interesting. Unfortunately, going too far off the beaten path just starts to load in random environment pieces that's never always the same. But one particular cool thing is that when you get to the part of the game where you're supposed to use the raft to get to the other continent, you can see that the raft itself is actually supposed to load the area. Otherwise, you just keep walking indefinitely until you get to the glitchy areas. And also, I just want to know what would happen if Link engaged an enemy on a mountain, since that's a tile you can't normally walk on. And if you do, you end up in a graveyard area every single time, and when you leave that graveyard area, you end up in Zelda's chamber. Also, removing layers in Zelda 2 tends to make some really odd effects, and one of the things I noticed is that removing a top layer tends to reveal the next screen over. And if we do this in the very last room of the game, you can actually see that the final room has its own wall, as well as some additional space that the player's not allowed to see. And lastly, if we remove the top layer on the title screen, you can actually see that the title of the game is hiding underneath the environment for a good while before it starts rising up. And as it does rise up, there's actually some graphical artifacts that are just below it, but it's still hidden by the environment. And one last thing for Zelda 2 before we move on, I wanted to show you that south of the original Hyrule, or Death Mountain I guess you would call it in Zelda 2, you can find an area that stores hundreds of river devils. This is so freaking bizarre. And I will say that this is something that's properly stored for whatever reason. This is the sort of stuff I live for with this show. And now onto A Link to the Past. This is when we start talking about maps and things get really, really interesting. So in order to move out of the boundaries in some areas like the overworld, I used a code that allows every tile that's on the map to be cut as if it's a bush, which then allows a clear path for Link. In doing so, we can see certain functions to certain things, like for example, the sky all the way on Death Mountain here, all the way at the top. If you were to actually be able to jump off, it functions like a body of water, which is really, really cool. And then of course, we want to know what happens when you go up a screen from this area that you're clearly not supposed to go any further. And it does seem to be a repeating screen of the one that we were just left on. You can see it's evidenced by the bridge and the clouds that are at the top. And then without fail, wherever you go outside the map, the game will fade to black and then just freeze. The game did not like that whatsoever. However, in indoor buildings, there's a little something interesting going on here. All of the rooms that are indoors in Link to the Past all share one giant map together, much like the overworld map. And if you were to go out of bounds, you could find different rooms to completely different parts of the game. So the question then becomes, where do we find the Chris Houlihan room? And if you don't know what the Chris Houlihan room is, it is a fail-safe room that was developed for The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, and even included a secret message for the player if you happen to find it by accident. Nintendo of America decided to be even cheekier about this and held a contest for Nintendo Power to allow your name to be in this room. And so, Chris Houlihan is the person who presumably won this contest and has now been immortalized in Out of Bounds content. Now that you're caught up with that lore, let's find it. It was actually really easy to find. It just happens to be one room to the right and one room north of the cathedral room. You get that far in the game? So, like, as long as you can clip out of bounds, you can reach the Chris Houlihan room pretty easily. And speedrunners have actually documented this underground map with the express purpose of being able to navigate it for speedruns. So, thanks to that effort, I can do a zoom out of the underground world of A Link to the Past and show you what that would look like in its entire glory. One other thing I want to show you guys that's actually really funny is that the blacksmith that normally tempers your sword has a chimney that has smoke blowing out of the stack. And I wanted to see what would happen if I touched the smoke, but funny enough, it wasn't the smoke that was interesting, it was the chimney itself, because that object shares the same functionality as a door. So when we touch the chimney stack, it opens up and gives you this garbled mess of sprites. And with that, now let's move on to Link's Awakening. Link's Awakening is a fascinating one, folks. I am so excited to talk about this one with all of you. Alright, so first of all, what happens when you touch the edge of the map this time? Well, touching the edge of the map this time will show you that Link ends up on the opposite end of the entire map. Pretty much any direction that you'd like to go, Link will just end up on the complete opposite end. which is something I was not expecting, not after A Link to the Past showing the garbled mess, and the original Legend of Zelda showing that it will warp you somewhere. I'm really surprised that this time around, it just loops you to the other end. It's really cool. And now here's the juicy bit. Indoor areas, dungeons, they have their own separate map, just like A Link to the Past did. However, this game has 2 underground maps, depending on which indoor area you start with. And there's all sorts of crazy stuff that can happen as you go through all these different rooms that are not supposed to share sprites with each other. And funny enough, completely by accident, I ended up finding an unused room in this game. I had to do some cross research to see if this was ever discovered before, and it turns out that not only is this one of many unused rooms, but there are many unused rooms that make up an entire floor according to the cutting room floor. That room, as well as these rooms that are pictured here, belong to an unused 3rd floor in the Eagle Tower, which I am shocked by. But not only that, I also want to talk about some rooms that are very confusing. This one here is one of those underwater rooms, you know, like the one you would go to get to the Angler Cavern. Well, this one has 2 moblins that are just sort of sitting underwater, and it took me a long while to figure out what these sprites were actually supposed to be. I kind of figured they were going to be fish because this is clearly the map that is used for when you go fishing. However, it turns out that these 2 moblin sprites represent the fishermen of all things. The moblin that's moving would normally be the fishing rod, and the moblin that's standing still is the fisherman himself. You could see that if you were to look at the fisherman in his correct spot and with his sprite properly mapped, that his fishing rod moves and his sprite can change based on where you talk to him. This is all figured out because when I talked to the stationary moblin, he has the same dialogue as the fisherman. Naturally, I chose to do the fishing minigame in this weird, bizarre spot, and what ends up happening is that the game actually brings you back to the fisherman on the outside instead of, you know, taking you to the fishing minigame, which is really funny. Also, what's really fun is that if you go to different rooms when you load a particular room, the sprite from the original room that you came from might end up spawning on other characters, and so you might find something like Marin trying to attack you in the woods, or one of the villagers just being all over the frickin' place because the game just maps that particular sprite to one character only. And then here's something that's really cool for you. The Garaya normally is pincered between a table and a wall, and so you'd never be able to get behind him to talk to him. However, despite the fact that he is a unique sprite and wouldn't need to have a sprite for looking behind him, if we boundary break into the wall and talk to him, we can see his little tail that has never been seen by the players. And that's all I got for now. If you'd like to see all of the other Zelda games in the series, I have a one-stop video for you. I'm going to put it at the end of the screen and in the video description. It takes you to my side channel. So click on that if you want to see out-of-bounds content for like Ocarina of Time or Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom. It's all there, including the games that were covered here on the main channel that I've never covered before. The side channel is definitely meant for people that like to fall asleep to content at night or want something running in the background while they're doing homework or something. Anyways, guys, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much and take care.